Welcome to the 3rd Annual Northbrook Historical Society Cemetery Walk. Over 1.5 million German immigrants arrived in America between the mid-1840s and the late 1860s. Many made their way here across the mountains to the prairies of Illinois, and they came because the land was affordable, just $1.25 an acre. Land speculation soon upped that price, but still they came, just as people continue to come today. The early settlers built their homes, planted crops, and founded some of the houses of worship and all of the schools that we have here in town today. Now it's time to meet representatives of some of the families to tell the stories that are part of our shared history. Please watch your step as you walk through the cemetery. The ground is wet, it's uneven, and with all the rain, it's especially a little soft. So please be very, very careful. And now I'd like to introduce you to Heinrich Meyer. Heinrich?
Hello, my name is Heinrich Meyer. I am the son of Rosine and Ludwig Meyer. My parents came to this area in 1847, and they lived in a log cabin which is Dundee and Waukegan Roads. I was born in 1853. In 1856, my parents bought acreage on bought 50 acres on what's now Telegraph Road. They built a barn just north of us, which was on Farnsworth and Telegraph Road. The farm eventually totaled 110 acres. It was bounded on the north by the 1500 Shermer Road building, on the south by Farnsworth, on the west by Western, and on the south by Farnsworth. The next lot line over ours is where my mother's sister, Rosina, and her husband, Heinrich Daney, lived. Our original house had one big room downstairs with cooking facilities and 3 bedrooms upstairs. On 2 different occasions, our house was added onto, as well as the Daney house, and it eventually became a 17-room house, which was 2 houses within one. When it came time to demolish the house for the new subdivision moving in, part of the house was moved over to Techney Road, where it sits today. It was nice having family nearby, my aunt and my uncle and their children. All of us children grew up together. The laughter of the children playing after the chores were done reminds me of good old days of growing up myself. Living on a farm, there wasn't much time for us to have much entertainment. Most of the entertainment that we had revolved around the family, school, and church activities. As a boy, I had the pleasure of shaking hands with Abraham Lincoln, and that's right, the President, Abraham Lincoln. I married Catherine Rugen, and we lived on the farm with Mom and Dad. We raised 7 children on the farm. Their names were Herman, Charles, William, Albert, Matilda, Henrietta, and Julia. I had to make sure I wrote their names down. You know how kids are. If you miss one, they never let you forget it. My wife loved to rock our children on her lap, and later our grandchildren, especially when they were troubled, got all their cares away. I bought the farm from Dad's estate in 1896 after his passing. I loved horses. I had 2 teams of horses. One team was white, all white. The other team was dark with white faces. On occasion, when we wanted to go to Niles Center, which is now called Skokie, we would take our horses and carriage. If we went to Chicago, we naturally would take the train. In 1916, Matilda married Fred Detman, and they took over the operation of the farm. I eventually retired and built a house closer to downtown Northbrook where we lived, and Fred and Matilda ran the farm. Matilda lived in the house until she was in her 80s. That was the only house that she ever lived in up until she was in her 80s. northern half of the farm was eventually subdivided, and that's where Oak and Illinois streets are now. Matilda's husband died in the 1970s. The house eventually became too big for her, so she moved in with one of her daughters. But her children lived in the house as well. So that was 4 generations that lived in that house. I really don't remember when the house was sold, but I know it was a strong, sturdy house that protected 4 generations of the Meyer family. We had a very good life.
Thank you very much for telling us your story. Now we're going to go meet Herman Lorenz. So if you'll follow me, I'd like to introduce you to Herman Lorenz. Herman?
Good afternoon. My name is Gustav Friedrich Herman Lorenz. You can call me Herman. And I'm going to tell you how the Lorenz family has kept the wheels of progress turning here in this area for over 5 generations. My father, Friedrich Lorenz, was a wagon maker back in Mecklenburg, Germany. He married Maria Rosenau in Germany, and as newlyweds, they decided to make a new life here in this country. So they traveled with other family members and friends from their village and settled here in Northfield Township. Now the farm that I grew up on was on State Road. You know State Road. A little bit later on they put the telegraph poles up there and they renamed it Telegraph Road. Oh, now wait a minute. Those are both old names for the road. You folks know it as Shermer Road today, right out here. Well, my parents had 2 sons before I was born, and they both died within 5 days of each other. And then when I was born, my mother had no children after me, so I was raised as a pampered only child. My mother died when I was just 8 years old, and 2 years later, Father remarried. And soon, there was joy and laughter in the house again as 3 little girls, one after another, were brought into the family. The youngest, Matilda, died before her first birthday. During my teens, my father bought some land from the estate of Mrs. Sherman. That was up Shermer Road, up State Road a little bit, up by the river. Now, a Mr. Shermer also bought some land there, and he sold pieces of his land for a cheese factory and for other businesses that were starting up next to that new railroad that had just come through town. Well, my father decided to move his business into that new little town that was growing up by the railroad station. So he built a new wagon shop on Shermer Road, right where the western part of the Village Green Park is today. And next to the wagon shop, he built a blacksmith shop where he manufactured steel bands that went around the wheels, or a customer could have their horses shod while their wagon was being repaired. In the late 1800s, 4 new horseshoes cost $1.60, and 4 wagon wheels, set and oiled, were just $2.25. I married Maria Holste, there's the Holste family monument right there, in 1880. 10 months later, our twins, Wilhelm, who we call Bill, and Emma were born. Now Emma passed away before she was 5 months old, and 2 weeks later, my father died. Our third and last child, Alfred, was born 5 years later. And by then, I'd built a new house for my Mary on Shermer Road next to our shop, right where Meadow Road goes through right today. The business of building and repairing wagons, buggies, carriages, carts, even sleighs was passed on to me when my father died in 1881. And in addition to running the wagon business, I served as president of the new village of Shermerville when it was incorporated. I served a total of 2 terms, a total of 17 years between 1902 and 1921. The first village hall for Schermerville was on the second floor of a building we owned next to our house. We donated the space there, which also housed the court and the fire department. And, in fact, I was one of the founders of the Schermerville Volunteer Fire Department when it was organized in 1901. I was a member for 25 years and served as its president for part of that time. For fire equipment, we had a wagon pulled by a team of horses, and we had a hand pumper called Little Red Susie. Now, Little Red Susie was operated with 4 firemen on each side of it, each pulling up and down on this big handle, pumping water out of whatever well or cistern was next to the scene of the fire. Little Red Susie was pulled to the fire by a single horse, and with Pete Bellard's harness shop across the street, and of course the blacksmith shop next door, there were always horses tied up to the hitching posts on Shermer Road. And we would use whatever horse was closest to get Little Red Susie to that scene of the fire. Of course, the owner of the horse didn't mind. Everybody cared about their neighbors and were interested in getting the fires put out. Now, our son Bill worked in our shop since his boyhood. And the wagon shop was a very good business until those newfangled horseless carriages came in. Well, we decided, rather than fight them, to join them. So, in 1906, we began repairing automobiles in our shop. In 1907, we started selling Standard Oil products. And in 1912, we started the first auto agency in the village of Schermerville. Loren's wagon shop became Loren's Garage. Now, you could buy a 5-passenger Studebaker with a 4-cylinder engine, an electric horn, silk mohair top, jiffy windows, and a full set of tools for $885. And we threw in free driving lessons. Of course, we had to teach the new drivers that simply yelling "whoa" at that automobile wouldn't make you stop. You had to push down on the brake pedal. And you had to dress the part. You had to have a long coat called a duster to keep the dust off of you. You had to have a cap to keep the hair out of your hair, and you had to have goggles to keep the dirt out of your eyes while you were driving. Now, I had the first automobile in town. Our doctor, Dr. Sensler, the only doctor in town, he got the second one. The undertaker, Mr. Benser, bought the third car. Our son Bill's father-in-law, George Rubin, got the fourth, and Bill himself got the fifth. Now, driving around there in those days was pretty difficult because the roads were all dirt. The only paved road in the whole area was Sheridan Road, paved with bricks. There wasn't any concrete or anything, and in fact, it took almost a whole day just to drive over to Glencoe and back. The main roads through Schermerville were Waukegan Road, which was gravel and mud in the low spots, and State Road, or Shermer Road, which was just dirt. In 1921, they put a concrete pavement on Waukegan Road, and everybody was so excited to be able to get their automobiles out for a nice Sunday drive on the new concrete road. As you leave, be sure and look at the picture of the cars on Waukegan Road, all lined up. Schermerville's first traffic jam. Now, we started our towing business when Bill bought an old Cadillac, and he chopped it off and he put a boom on it and added some firefighting equipment and first aid equipment, and all of a sudden we're in the towing business. Bill's son Herman, named after me, became his right-hand man. And he worked on the farm equipment, the farm wagons, and he also repaired the customers' automobiles. In addition to working in the garage, Herman became a fireman, continuing the volunteer tradition of the Lorenz family. He also served as Northbrook, as it was known at this time, policemen. At the time, Northbrook was patrolled by a single policeman who patrolled on Saturday and Sunday, mostly looking for picnickers who got a little boisterous. The jail was this large wooden cage set on a field outside the city hall. And one night, Herman arrested a drunk, locked him up in the jail, and came back the next morning to get him, and the jail was empty. It turns out that this large jail wasn't fastened to the ground, and this gentleman had simply picked it up and crawled out underneath it. Herman sure was embarrassed to have lost that prisoner. When we first started selling gasoline, we didn't have a pump or anything like that, so we had a big barrel inside the garage, and it had a spigot on it. And when somebody wanted gasoline, we'd turn that spigot, fill up the can full of gasoline, we'd take it out to the car, and with a funnel, we'd just fill up the car. You know, we got our gasoline back then from a company over in Highland Park. And would you believe they delivered it to us with a horse and wagon? We got our first pump and we set it out on Shermer Road, opposite where the window to the garage, the Northbrook garage is right now. Now that pump had 5 little levers, and you'd pull down 1 lever for 1 gallon, 2 levers for 2 gallons, so on to 5 levers for 5 gallons. And then you had to pump it by hand. At 14 cents a gallon, a 5-gallon fill-up cost 70 cents. A quart of oil cost just 30 cents. Now Bill, he wasn't all work and no play. Square dancing was big entertainment back then, and Bill used to go to barns all over the area and call the square dances. He also provided the entertainment. You see, Bill could play the accordion, the violin, the guitar, and the mandolin. My Mary died in 1907, and I followed her in 1928. We were the last of the Lorenz family to be buried here at St. Peter's Cemetery. The rest of the Lorenz family is buried over at Ridgewood Cemetery in Des Plaines. I've seen a lot of changes in the transportation business in my lifetime. And the 5th generation Lorenz, Jay, is now running the Northbrook Garage, still located at the corner of Shermer and Meadow. That business is the oldest continuously owned family business in the state of Illinois. And in 1988, a Motor Magazine survey indicated it was the oldest family-owned garage in the entire country. Well, that's the story of the Lorenz family today. Stay tuned to see what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. We appreciate you telling your story.
So in 1883, I sat down and I began a diary. The life history of Henrik Wilhelm Denny. I was born on August 10th, 1826 in the village of Radenburg, county of Schaumburg, province of Hessen. I was baptized in the church at Siegelhorst by Pastor Killian. I attended school for 7.5 years and was confirmed by Pastor Killian. And then I worked as a farmer for 2.5 years, and then learned the trade of a shoemaker for 3 years, and worked as a journeyman for 3.5 years in Germany. Then in the year 1846, 15th of October, I came to America, and specifically to Northfield, Illinois. February 11th, 1849, I married Louise Bolger, also of Rodenburg. Worked for anything that came along for the first few years, then I worked for the next 20 years as a shoemaker. Then I gave that up, became a farmer. We have 3 children born to us. 1 daughter born December 2nd, 1849 in Deerfield, and was baptized and confirmed in Northfield. Her name was Marie Justine. A son was born in June 1st, 1851. His name was Henrik Ludwig, baptized and confirmed in Northfield. Ludwig Wilhelm was born on July 30th, 1856. He was baptized and confirmed in Northfield. The last 2 in the Evangelical Lutheran St. Peter Church. We worked with our children on the farm until the 16th of February, 1887, on which date I lost my wife to the death at age 70 years, 8 months, and 28 days. That's when I gave up the farm. Then I married again on November 3rd, 1887, Ernestine, maiden name Buckmeyer, from Burkholz, Buckenberg, and she was the widow of Carl Brinkman. We lived a peaceful marriage and we got along very well with the children and held fast with our church and school. We are also the oldest settlers in this community, and we're known far and wide for our upright and honest character. She was buried along with people in attendance at Evangelical St. Peter's Cemetery. Well, that's what I wrote. Let me add a few facts so you can understand a little more what my life was like at that time. During the years that I was a shoemaker, each fall I'd walk into Chicago and get leather. Then during the winter I'd make boots and shoes, and then I'd sell those and use the profit to buy seed for the plantings that we needed, and any livestock that we may need. What I had left over, I put away till the next fall to buy more leather. Any additional, sometimes of course I did take in trade, I'd take seed and stock for boots and shoes. Decided I wanted to get out of the shoe business, and we began dairy farming. And running a dairy farm is a lot of hard work. Up at 5 every morning to milk the cows, all done by hand, no machinery back then. Then in the evening you had to milk the cows again. Then any extra milk we had, we'd put on the buggy or the horse and wagon and run up to the railroad depot in the morning to be picked up by the train. Children and grandchildren helped around, of course. They had all jobs of their own, before school and after school. Before school, they'd have to clean out the barn, get the cattle fed, then get them out to pasture. Then when they got home, they'd help bring the cattle in from the pasture, feed them, take care of the horses. Horses ran all the equipment, farm equipment, and the wagons, so we always had plenty of horses. We had other animals too. We had chickens and pigs, lambs, steer, goats. Oh, we had this goat one time, Billy Goat, and he just loved to climb. One of the outbuildings, we had grain stored in it, and next to it we had this lean-to. We kept farm equipment up in that lean-to. If we ever parked a wagon up close to that lean-to, that Billy Goat would jump on that wagon, then he'd jump on that lean-to, and he'd walk up on top of that granary and then hold his head over the edge of that granary and bellow until somebody would, me, get up there and get him down. We also planted Timothy hay and other crops to feed the herd. Good thing we did that. A lot of hot and dry summers in the 1890s when we were starting to feed the cows by July. Then each fall we'd do our butchering of the steers and pigs, make sure we had enough meat for the year. Our farm adjoined the farm of my wife's sister and her husband, Ludwig Meyer. Our property included the area south of Farnsworth Lane, where the Westcott Park area is, west of Shermer Road, north of Techney, and east of Western Avenue. We didn't own the corner there on Shermer and Techney. That was owned by George Weber for his blacksmith shop. So the backyards of most of the homes on Somerton was the lot line of our farm. We had a little over 100 acres in total. Our dairy farm continued for 3 generations until the late 1940s when we sold it to a developer that was using building in Northbrook. In fact, Northbrook built a fire station pretty close to my property. Let's see, what else? Oh yeah, there was something happened during my lifetime that probably you haven't heard of here in Northbrook for a while. At 3:20 in the morning on May 19th, 1906, the earth shook and the windows and the doors in the house rattled by an earthquake. I'm telling the truth here. We were run over by an earthquake here in town. I thought those were important dates, so I put them in my diary so I wouldn't forget them. Kept writing out the simple stuff in here, such as how much hay or rye or corn we cut. And then when we had to do those good jobs of cleaning out the manure in the barns, how many days it took me to get rid of all that. Also kind of put in other things such as the dates and how much the rates of the products that we did sell. Well, thanks for listening to my ramblings. Nice to see you out here today.
My name is Michael Lees. I lived a good and simple life, much like many of the others in the area. I was 12 years old in 1852, when my parents and I left our homeland in Germany. We lived in New York while Dad worked and saved enough money for us to buy some good Illinois farmland. My mother died in January of 1854. We were still in New York back then. After her death, Dad and I traveled west to Northfield Township so we could live with some of our friends and neighbors from the old country. In April of 1854, shortly after we arrived here, I was confirmed at the predecessor to the St. Peter's Church. Round about planning time in 1861, there was a lot of talk about a war, but it became a lot more than that. In some place called Charleston, some of the locals started shooting at the army on a fort in the middle of the bay. That really upset President Lincoln, and he called for some help to put down the rebellion. We thought it would be all over by midsummer, but it didn't really happen that way. By harvest time, a fellow in a fancy blue suit came up our way and told us that the very freedom that we had come here to get was being threatened. The only way we could stop it was if we joined up to help them put those rebels back in their places. That's just what us Northfield boys did. After signing up, we hitched a ride on a wagon going down to Chicago. We got to the Army camp on October 23rd. I had never seen so many fellows in my entire life. There must have been a couple thousand of us. I ran into Fred Schindler there. He took us over to a building. It was a new wood building. They put 80 of us inside that building. Imagine that, it was only 60 feet long, and they had black tar paper on the outside. That was the only thing that kept the wind from whistling through between the boards. Inside they had us stacked up too high, and there was only one stove to keep us warm. No wonder that several of us were sick by the time we left. We were pretty well filled up with the energy of youth, and we kept yelling around, shouting that they had better save some of the fighting for us. It seemed like every week another regiment got together and marched out of the camp in their new uniforms. They went off to fight those gray-shirted devils. Well, by the end of December, it was our turn. Those of us who were still well enough to march, we lined up in front of our camp and we marched down to the railroad station. That was the last time the Army ever put a roof over my head. After a long trip by the train and then by paddleboat, we finally joined the rest of the Army. It was the dead of winter, and by then we found ourselves engaged in 2 battles before we even realized it. All I can remember is the noise, the cold, and a lot of marching. One time, we were put down in front of some cannons. They had us shoot off into the distance. We didn't even know what we were shooting at, and the cannons were just booming over our heads. I remember for the next week, my ears rung from all that noise. We fought along the Tennessee and the Ohio rivers that winter, capturing Fort Henry and Fort Donaldson, and on down to Crump's Landing. Our regiment was subjected to severe hardships and exposure on the march. I can really still remember how bitterly cold it was that winter, and how our clothes froze stiff after we had to cross a creek. It makes me cold just to think about it. At a place called Pittsburgh Landing, I saw many of the boys fall. Our lieutenant, who was so proud of his fancy blue uniform with the gold buttons all down the front. The shooting was all too much for him, though. He shamed himself, and he quit and ran home that very day. Frederick Shank, another of the, the Northfield boys fought side by side that April in 1862. It was a place called Shiloh. My buddies Henry Meyer and Philip Arnold, I saw them mortally wounded there and carried off the battlefield. They were still alive, but Henry, he died a few days later while being taken to a military hospital in St. Louis. Philip, he died in July in Quincy, Illinois, while he was still trying to recover from his wounds. Some months later, the regiment was sent to a place called Corinth. They told me that was down in Mississippi. There were some terrific battles there. We captured the town, and there were more battles as we defended the town as the rebels tried to take it back from me. But it was there that I got a pretty sore, severe neck wound. And I was hurt in the head too. Frederick Shank, another of the Northfield boys, was wounded in the shoulder. He and I were sent to the camp hospital and then on to St. Louis. I guess that I was pretty lucky. I saw a lot of fellers that were a lot worse off than me. I spent a long time in the hospital. Before then, they told me to go home. They gave me some papers and sent me on my way. I guessed that my time in the Army was over, and I wasn't going to have to shoot at anybody anymore. Soon I went home and I decided it was time that I should go looking for a wife. You know, I think I found a pretty good one. Ladies and gentlemen, let me present my wife, Marguerite Stippich, please.
Alongside the river, there was even a railroad that came through town. A few years later, we actually had a stop here in Northfield Township, and it and the town were named after our friend, Friedrich Sherman. Our fourth child was born shortly after we arrived here, and we lived a quiet life raising our crops and our children on 30 acres of land on Waukegan Road at the northeast corner of Waukegan and Walters. Michael used to participate in local government. He was very proud of his service and he took it seriously, attending all the meetings to make sure that he could vote. A few years after we settled here, he was appointed road commissioner for our district, a position he proudly filled for several years, and he was then elected and remained one of 2 constables. We worked hard and we had a good life. Albert, our youngest child, was born, and when I died, he was just a lad of only 7. A year later, Michael married again. He married a woman 25 years younger than he was, and she was only a year older than our oldest child. Michael applied for a Civil War pension in March 1903. Although he was just 63, by then he was quite young. While the pension application was being processed, he died. From what I've told you about him, how devoted he was to public service and to fighting for his country, you'll be very surprised by what happened next. A letter came from Washington, D.C. saying that his pension had been denied. Why? Because he was a deserter. There had to be some kind of mistake. Michael, of course, could have cleared it up very quickly, but he was gone by now. He told us all stories about his war service and how proud he was. This made no sense. It seems that the piece of paper they had given him when he went on leave was furlough. He had a piece of paper that described him as going on a hospital furlough. But it seemed that when the furlough was over, they expected him to go back. And he didn't know that. Even Henry Schnatt, who joined the 57th Illinois after Michael was injured, signed a pension affidavit saying that he was a good, upstanding man and had been for the 30 years that they were neighbors and fellow congregants at the St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church. After Michael's death, the family scattered. Most moved to the city, and for several years, his second wife, Mary, tried to find people from the unit to tell her what had happened. Unfortunately, all those who attended church with him had begun to die, and she could find no one from the unit who could verify the story. In 1911, 7 years after his death, she located and spoke to a soldier who had served with Michael, and she again wrote to the Pension Bureau, and she even hired a lawyer to work on Michael's behalf, so that the good name of Michael Lease could be cleared. Unfortunately, his name was never officially cleared, and if you go to Washington, D.C. now and you ask for his pension file, you will find a very thin file with his muster papers and his application paper, and a note from the lawyer saying that he thought that Michael's name could be cleared. There was a senator, Senator J. Hamilton Lewis, who even tried to clear up the matter in 1934 when he requested the names of surviving members of the unit. Remember Frederick Shank, the man who was wounded when Michael was wounded? I'm told that if you request his pension file in Washington, you'll find he also was sent on a hospital furlough, and he was also listed as a deserter, but his name was eventually cleared. I wonder why Michael's name was never cleared. I guess we'll never know. But all I can tell you is that my husband was a good, upstanding man, and he served his country honorably. Thank you for listening to our story this afternoon.
Thank you for telling your story. Now we're going to walk all the way to the back of the cemetery where we're going to meet 2 more people buried there. 3 more.
Hello.
Thank you.
My name is Margaret Kilby Volz. I came to this country with my parents, 3 brothers and a sister, from Steppenbach, Baden, Germany. We made our way to Chicago, where I stayed, when the rest of my family left to go up and settle in Leelanau County, Michigan, way up north in a town called Good Harbor. The timber up there was good, and ships carried the wood down the lake to Chicago to help build housing in the growing city. Well, because of that, I did get to see some of my family occasionally. My husband Louis and I met while we were both living in Jefferson Township, which was just north of Chicago. We were married in 1862. Louis worked bought 40 acres of land from a Mr. Davis along an old Indian trail called Little Fort Road. We built a beautiful home in a wooded section on a rise at the corner of what is now known as Waukegan and Volz Roads. In fact, we left the crowded city behind and moved north to the prairie. Our third child was baptized at St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church in 1867. In all, 12 children were born to us. Well, sadly, our firstborn son, called Louis, named after our husband, died just a few days after his 12th birthday, and he's buried right here. It was just 2 years later, little baby Ella died at the age of 7 months. Well, 10 of our children grew to adulthood. 2 of the boys, Frank and Richard, never married. Our son, William, our second-born son, died at the age of 31, leaving behind a grieving wife and a young daughter. And he's buried up near the front of the cemetery. In all, there are 15 children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren buried here in the cemetery with Louis and me. We worked hard to raise our children to be good, solid citizens, and how could they be anything but? Their father was a very important man. I was very proud of the work Louis did, especially for our community. And well, I'll let him tell you about that. Louis?
Town of Northfield was a very important part of my life. And I guess you could say that I was a very important part of its life, too. That's not quite right. I was a very important part of 2 towns and their life. The only form of local government was the town, the township. I served first as a road commissioner. Then I was elected as supervisor, township supervisor. April 1883. Most of the English settlers had moved on by then. So we were a predominantly German community. None of this 4-year term stuff. We elected people every year. Of course, most people were busy enough with their farms that they needed the time to work on that, and so they were on and off as far as being elected. In fact, most of them needed the money from being the officer to help pay for getting the farm and house working. And if we didn't like the way they did it, we just voted them out of office. As the roads got built and the improvements were made, the job of the supervisor got a lot easier. Life in the town was a lot better. The town actually had a number of different settlements. They were just named according to geography. We lived up in East Northfield. Out there in that other corner of the township was Northfield. Out west there was the Grove, the wooded place where the Kennicott settled, in the West Northfield. Down there was South Northfield. Some of the names changed, some of them disappeared, but it was still 2 decades almost before we ended up with these new towns of Glenview and Shermerville. (1887). They split the township into 2 precincts, north and south. 1 and
Usually the town meetings where we did the electing were held at one of those houses around the train station, what you call Northbrook. That year the meeting was at the home of Mr. John A. Hutchings. You may know that house. It's a place where they have the Glenview Historical Society, I'm told. That was the beginning of dividing the township into two towns, each setting their own laws, raising their taxes for their own improvements. Didn't happen right away. A lot of people started moving into the area called the Park, down in South Northfield, Precinct 1, 2. And they finally got enough that they kept pushing and they wanted improvements, so well, that's sort of the long and short of it. They got the town of Glenview in 1899. We didn't have nearly enough people around Schermerville because that was the name of the place now, you know, the railroad station, and the post office changed its name. Thank goodness we didn't have enough people for another town. But then, the Illinois Brick Company moved in. Up on John Bach's farm, up north of that place they call Dundee now. And they started moving in workers in that place across the road. And before long, you know, there were 300 people in that 2 square mile area around the train station. And some of them wanted to tax to get improvements. Took a while. You know, you got 300 people. Half of them are women, and the other half are children. So to get 30 legal signatures on a petition to put it on the ballot, it took a little while. I finally got 16 out of Bachtown, 15 from around the station. Would you believe 4 merchants even put their signatures on it? But there's one name you won't find on there. Mine. So, the judge set a date. November 16, Saturday, 1901. We went to the polls, did our voting. Monday, the judge canvassed the results. 69 votes. Now, we'll never know for sure who cast which vote. But it's a sure bet that the 35 people who wanted the petition signed were the same 35 people that voted for it. 2 of them were spoiled ballots. So that left 32 votes against. And the judge declared that the town of Schermerville was now established. By 3 votes. So the judge set a date for an election, president, trustees, clerk. When those votes were cast, I was elected the president for a year's term. But the real surprise was we who had fought against it outnumbered those who had spurred for it. And all those hoped for improvements, well, they didn't happen very fast. We voted no on everything that involved spending money, basically. A year later, Herman Lawrence was elected to be the president. first of his terms over a period of 17 years as president, on and off. I was 70 years old. I was out of politics. Children were running the farm. Margaret and I just settled back and enjoyed the grandchildren. She died in June 1905. I followed her 7.5 years later. So, next time you see Volts Road, remember us and the story we told today. And please, remember to vote!
Frida Bucher Werhing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Frida Bucher Weerheen. I am the fifth daughter, the fifth child of Johann Bucher and Carolyn Punter. I was born in April 1884 and came to America with my parents and 8 brothers and sisters when I was 9 years old. All of our worldly possessions we packed in one trunk when we left Germany. We first came to Glenview and stayed with my mother's sister, Mrs. Henry Trebold. My parents' 10th child was born shortly after we arrived in America, and my youngest brother was born 5 years later. For the first 7 years that we lived in Shermerville, Papa rented the 80-acre Oldfield farm on Shermer Road. It's where Glenbrook North High School is now. We had a herd of cows, and Papa's cash crop was potatoes. Acres and acres of potatoes. Since neither of my parents ever learned to speak English, one of us children were required to go with Papa in the wagon when he sold potatoes in Chicago. The younger children went to school at Maple School, which at the time was located across the street from where the current Maple School is. When I finished school, I went to work for my sister Carrie's husband, Henry Schroeder. They owned the market and the grocery on Park Avenue in Glencoe. About that time, Mama and Papa bought their farm, which was 40 acres, on Sanders Road out near Lake Cook Road. Now the Oldfield farm, well, Buchers continued to farm that for many years. First, my eldest brother John and his wife, and then my sister Mary and her husband, Emil Mincer. In 1905, I married John Weerheen. Now, my husband's family had a long, deep roots in this township. They came over in the late 1840s with other families from the village of Hattendorf in Hessen, Germany. In lieu of paying his son's wages for working on the family farm, John's father gave each of his 4 sons a portion of the 240-acre family farm as a wedding gift. Well, since John was the eldest and firstborn, he was given first preference, and he chose a 60-acre parcel that Waukegan Road fronted the west of it. It ran nearly from the Forest Preserve all the way out to Lake Cook Road, and it was pretty near a square parcel, with the railroad tracks on the west and Waukegan Road on the east. Oh, there we were, newlyweds with clear title to 60 acres, and no buildings. Not a house to live in, not a barn for our livestock. So we built a house. John and I had one child, a son. His name was Louis. Maybe you knew him, but everybody called him Louis. Oh, we started out as a dairy farm, and those first years, they were tough. It took us a while to build that herd up. In 1908, we started selling eggs, and one of our first customers was Major George W. Coombs, a Civil War veteran who lived in Highland Park. Now, in those early years, two of my brothers, Henry and William, worked at the brickyard on the other side of the train tracks from us, so they boarded with us, and in the mornings they would just walk across our fields to get to work. In 1918, maybe it was 1919, John started planting the first sweet. Now, Louis Oberon, their farm was where, well, you'd know it because that's where Borders bookstores now. Louis Oberon and I had this idea of taking a table down to the roadside and selling corn to the motorists. My John thought we'd lost our minds. You know what happened? We brought in $7 that first day, and he said, might have possibilities. In 1922, Waukegan Road was first paved, and the Illuminated Sign Company of Chicago came out. We struck a deal with them. I thought it was pretty good. In exchange for them to put a big sign out that they illuminated from dark until midnight every night, we had the use of a 32-volt generating system to have electricity in the house. That same year, the vegetable stand was put out by the edge of the road, and it stayed there till, about 1930. And then we moved it to the back of the house, and there it stayed even till Louis and Olive were farming, and I think they probably closed that about 1969. Now, in 1924, John and some of our neighbors decided to contract and have electric light poles and wire brought out to our farms from County Line Road. It was our own electricity. You know what that meant? It meant that public service, that was ComEd now, wanted to use those lines, they should pay us. And that's how electricity came to these parts for the first time. But my favorite is 1927. That was a memorable year for my family. That year, John and I took a trip by train all the way out to California. Now, Louis stayed at home, being in the care of a friend of ours, and we had a wonderful trip. And my John was always friendly, wanting to talk to strangers and friends alike. And you know, our son Louis was a lot like John in that respect. Well, anyway, there we are in California. We're coming home, and John's visiting with the conductor of the Olympian. That was the name of the train. And they get talking, and John asks, could he drop us off on Northbrook at the local train station? And the conductor said, well, train's ahead of schedule, why not? That was the first and only time that a cross-country train made an unscheduled trip to drop people off at Northbrook. Now, my John was a successful farmer, and I really think that one of the reasons was that he was always willing to try new things. And he was forever saying that as soon as tractors came out with rubber tires, he would be the first to buy it. Well, he was. The commotion at the farm lasted a long time. But the best part of that, I really think that's what brought Louis back to farming. After John died, Louis and Olive continued farming the land. First in the 1940s, it was a hog production farm. Then by the 50s, he had transitioned into the egg business. And, well, at its peak, 7 chicken houses, 1,600 chickens. Wow. So, with the sale of 17 acres to the Illinois Toll Road in 1957, and then another 30 acres to the Deerfield Shopping Center in 1969, our farm changed dramatically. I continued to live with Louie and Olive up until the time I had a stroke that left me unable to care for myself. And then after 8 weeks in the hospital, I went to live with a registered nurse who took wonderful care of me. I passed on in October of 1972 at the age of 89. And Louie and Olive, they continued to farm until they sold the last of the land to Red Roof Inn in 1987. Now, if you go out to that spot, there's still a hotel and a restaurant there. And there's a plaque on the side of the hotel, and it says, original site of the Wayside Farm. Farmed from 1865 to 1987 by 6 generations of Weirhams. A pioneer Northfield Township family since 1848. Louis J. and Olive Weirham, proprietors of the last self-sufficient family farm in Northbrook. That's my story. Thank you for coming. Before you leave, this is our family tree, or a piece of it.
Oh, that's what that is.
Thank you very much, Frida. You've heard some of the stories of the settlers and of the last family farm in the village. You may ask how we come up with the stories that we portray here at these cemetery walks. This year we chose to concentrate on people who had left either first-hand accounts of their lives in diaries or papers or letters, or accounts from their children or grandchildren. So we hope that you will think about that when you go home and write down some of these stories for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so that when your memory is going a little bit south like mine is, you'll have those, and they will be treasured always. Also share them with your local historical society. Thank you very much for coming.